If you're going to have employees, eventually there will be conflict, especially between them. How can we or should we address, resolve, and reduce the frequency of those distractions? Stay tuned, and I'll share some tips that worked for me.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
As an employee, some of the most unpleasant situations I ever had to work through were a result of the tension caused by a conflict between coworkers. And I'm sure there's nobody listening to this who hasn't experienced something like that to some degree as well. And as a manager, some of the absolute worst situations I ever found myself in were due to employee conflict I didn't know how to help resolve, but then had to work through anyway. Like, I had to deal with the consequences of this thing, but sometimes I didn't really even know how to resolve it and how to make it go away and how to make it better. As a business owner, it's so tough to try to walk the tightrope of appeasing employees so they feel like we're supporting them, but staying clear of choosing sides so we don't ostracize an employee or, make one of them feel like, hey, yeah, they got my back and he showed them who the other person was wrong. Like, that is absolutely a situation I want to avoid. And having employees really at each other, but still in a situation where they must work together, creates such a negative, unproductive environment. And our service and our culture and all those things suffer tremendously. So how do we get in front of this stuff? What do we do when it happens? How do we prevent it as much as we can? I think we have to start with reality. I really don't think there's a scenario in which you can have a staff of several people for a long period of time and not have some kind of conflict. We can't even do that at home. How are we going to do that at work? This is something we just have to accept. It's going to happen. And of course, that doesn't mean you have to like it, but humans are human. we can't expect them to do things that are unhuman-like, right? I also don't think it's reasonable to expect them to know how much or how little responsibility and initiative I want them to take to resolve, prevent these kinds of things without me providing that insight. I think this is one of the things that is hard for us to reconcile with. We hire people and kind of think, well, I want good people who are going to do the right thing. And I don't want people who are a pain in the butt. And I want people when there's problems, they proactively resolve them. But if I ask a bunch of people, what does that mean? It probably has different meanings for different folks. So this is one of those areas where I think it's on me to help articulate with very specific language what I mean when I say things like that. The idea that they should just figure out how I want conflict resolved without any input from me is not a serious approach, in my opinion. I just think that's a fantasy. I don't think that's reality. And I'll say getting out in front of employee conflicts is 100% what got me to come around on concepts we hear a lot about, like core values. For two decades at least, my opinion on companies establishing core values, I thought it was all hogwash. I really did. Part of that is because a company I worked for, where I first was introduced to this idea, they rolled out these core values in their mission statement, and it was this big whole page of words. And they had a committee formed to develop it, and they made a production out of it, and then it was meaningless afterwards. So the value was in creating it, not living it, if that makes sense. And so that was my first exposure to it. And I worked for other companies who would have core values or mantras or mottos or, things that they might call a mission statement or whatever. And they were selectively used. Certainly leadership was not held to those standards, but the employees were, and it was more like a hammer than a guiding principle. It came out when it served a purpose, and it was tucked neatly away at other times. But I found myself in a situation where we had employees that were in a confined space. They were in one big office. There's 4 desks there, 4 people there together, 40, 50 hours a week. and tempers would flare sometimes. Like things would go sideways sometimes. And I kept finding myself not able to verbalize what this is supposed to look like and what standard to hold people to. And so I finally gave up and said, I went to a industry annual conference, the convention kind of thing. And there was a lady there talking about core values. I'm like, gosh, that's such crap. But you know what? I'm willing to try it because what I'm doing now ain't working. And so I came back to the office and I sat everybody down and we created our core values. And once we did, I now had a standard to hold people to. I had a language we all had come up with that said this is the code of conduct here, and we all will be held to this standard. And when people fell off, as they will, we had very specific language where we articulated what we're supposed to do in these situations. So I think identifying and teaching the standards of behavior we're going to hold ourselves to is a critical step to resolve infighting. It was a huge change for us. And one of the beauties of this was the way we did, because we kind of rolled out core values, several years after our company had started. We did the exercise together because I wanted buy-in from them, and I was very cautious of having this hammer approach that I had experienced as an employee where these things were selectively used, and I wanted to be something we all agreed on. And I wanted them to really buy in and participate in a proactive way. So what we ended up with was not just a list of words like accountability and ownership and that kind of stuff. Those aren't necessarily the words we use, but we didn't just have a list of words like that. We also included short affirming statements versus using just a word. So, for example, many folks have some kind of a core value that talks about accountability, which in almost all cases there's a reason that's the case. So I like having something super short and sweet, like we take accountability for our actions, period, is much more meaningful and helpful than accountability alone, especially in our employee conversations. If an employee is having a conflict and they feel like it's not really their problem to deal with, it's Sally's job to go figure this out. When I say, well, listen, one of our core values is we take accountability for our actions, uh, we take accountability for our actions. That's different than saying, well, listen, one of our core values is accountability. It just has a different meaning. There's more depth and meaning, and it's asserting we do this thing. It's not this word we're aspiring to. And I think that context is very, very helpful in those conversations. At least for me, it was a game changer because when those things inevitably happened, the same group of people who had the same conflict they had 3 weeks before we did this or 3 months before we did this, I had the conversation like, okay, we said we take accountability for our actions. What does that look like in this situation for you? And that's a different conversation than one of our core values is accountability. So if you have core values, but you just have a list of words, I would encourage you to think about writing out just, again, super short and sweet. One sentence, two very short sentences, something to say we do, we are, just to, this is not a thing we're striving to. I treat core values very much like Yoda. There is no try. We do or we do not. And I wanted that binary, right? All right. The next thing I got to figure out is how do I want this to work in the future? Meaning, when there is conflict, which there's going to be, if I have people who are passionate about their work, there is going to be conflict. And that's not a horrible thing. I think there's times where it's actually very beneficial. Deep seated problems come to the surface pretty quickly when there's real conflict. And when people are passionate about doing a good job, there's going to be more of that, not less of that. And so I don't look at conflict as being a negative. So that's one of the things that, not even in my notes here, but thinking through this, that I think that's important to point out. Conflict, just for the sake of conflict, that's not a negative thing. If they didn't care, there would be no conflict. If they don't care, I got much bigger problems. So anyhow, my question for myself is, how do I want this to work in the future? How do I want them when there is this conflict? Like, how is it supposed to get resolved? And part of my answer for me personally is I don't ever, 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 unless absolutely necessary, want to be in a situation where I'm the judge. And it's like the people's court. And you're the plaintiff and the defendant. The plaintiff brings their case to my office. The defendant's sitting in the other chair arguing their point, and then I got to determine who's right and who's wrong. And one person walks out celebrating, and the other person walks out defeated. That is a situation I absolutely want to avoid at all costs. I do have a role, though, in helping them identify and take the next steps. So the plaintiff brings me their thing instead of saying, well, bring Sally in here. Let's get to the bottom of this. I don't do that. I say, how do you think we should handle this? And I ask this question with the word we. I don't say, how do you think you should handle this? I ask how we should handle this because I want to know, does this person talking to me, does John who brought me this problem, does he think this is on me to solve or on him to solve? And when I say, how do you think we should handle this? His answer is likely to indicate that. Well, I was hoping you'd bring in here and we talk about it. Okay, that's me handling the problem. Now I'm the judge. Versus John saying, well, I know I need to handle this, but she's had a rough week, or she's very sensitive about this issue, or last time I tried this, it didn't work. Whatever those situations are, I don't know what to do. Now I have a role in helping John proactively resolve this. And I am interested in that role because I want to help him get better at this, because that makes the entire culture better and it makes my life easier. So I want to understand how they should handle this, but I also need to understand for me, what does success look like as far as how these things get resolved? How much of this is driven by me or decided by me, and how much is driven by them and resolved by them? So I want to have some kind of clarity on that. One of the things that I proactively told our staff regularly, and for the last 5 years before I left my company, I would talk about this with new hires on day one. And by then, the great news is I had done it long enough that the other staff would support it. And what I said to them was, not only do you have the authority to point out and help us solve problems, but you also have the responsibility. Now, for a while, when I first started doing that, people thought it was one of those things the boss is supposed to say. Well, of course he's saying that. Everybody has their version of that. You're supposed to say that kind of stuff. And I would tell him, I'm not really interested in whose fault things are, which I truly am not. I am interested though very much in resolving and reducing and stopping known problems that could repeat. That I'm very interested in. But whose fault it in, or whose fault it is, I'm just not that interested in that. Because if one person can do it wrong, so can somebody else. So for me personally, that's just not something I'm hung up on. Your version might be different, and that's fine. But I set the table for how these things get resolved way before they even happen. I say, you have the authority and the responsibility to help us solve problems that we know could happen again. And everyone had that. And so that molding that into the culture of, I don't really care whose fault things are, minimize the notion people would bring me something and say, Sally really screwed this up, because my response would be, I'm not interested in who did it wrong. I'm interested in why it happened and how we prevent it again. And over time, over the course of several months to, for sure by years in, when I would have that conversation and explain to the new hire and say, I'm not really interested in whose fault things are. I am interested in identifying the root cause of problems and preventing them from happening again. And you have the authority and responsibility to help us identify those things. When I say that to the new hire on day one, the other staff who would hear me say it say, listen, I know you probably think he's just saying that. He really means it. And this is how we operate. And that prevented a tremendous amount of that. So there's lots of prevention stuff in here we can do. But when the thing actually happens, I got to get clear on what is my role here. And my objective personally, for me, because I'm selfish, as I told you before, I don't want to be the judge. I don't want the employee who, quote unquote, loses the argument to be pissed at me because I made the call they didn't like. That's not what I want. I want them to figure it out. And I want them to figure out in a proactive way that makes us better, not creates rifts. And once we articulated that and we held each other to that, I could point to those statements we had agreed upon and said, well, here's the playbook for this situation. What do you think we should do? And then if they had questions like, well, I'm not really sure how to bring it up. Okay, let's talk it out. What do you think you could try? Let's role play it a little bit. Like, what are you going to say what are you going to open with? And well, hey, Sally, I think we got this problem here. How do you think she's likely to respond? Well, she can only respond positively or negatively. Okay, so what do we do? And walking them through that, I think that is my role. And I do want to help support them and help them have these conversations in a positive, productive way, not turn into infighting and emotional outbursts and things like that that can be not only unproductive, but can cause real scars in the culture of the company. So I got to get clear on how I want this to work in the future. And I got to know, as long as I'm going to have employees, there's going to be friction here and there. And knowing that I don't want to be up to me to decide who's right and wrong in every case, I've got to have kind of how I think this should go way before it even happens. And then developing the values that matter to me, which would be the standard of conduct we all hold each other to, hold each other accountable to maintain those, whether dealing with conflict or not. Having those things in place made my life immensely easier because I could point to them and say, this is what we said we are. This is a standard behavior we hold ourselves to. How does that apply in this situation? Or I might even say, looking at our core values, which of those things do you think applies in this situation? Which in many cases, many of them will, more than one will. Okay. And so what I've done here is I'm not bailing on them at all. I'm here to support them, but I'm not here to take the problem away from them. And so following those kinds of steps really, really, really turned the corner for us in how our culture operated. We went from sometimes very petty, sometimes very emotional, outbursty kind of things to, they stole my lunch money kind of stuff to, hey, we had this problem and I got to help us get better. And sometimes they went along with that better than others. There's times where like, this is crap. You should be helping me out. You're the boss. Okay. Well, if you go try it first, if it doesn't work, then you come let me know. But again, I wasn't there just to jump in and solve the problem. I wanted us to get better, not get pettier, if that makes any sense. So, long story short, this is the place where I think that for me, core values help the absolute most. And again, I resisted that for many, many years. It wasn't like I heard core values. I'm like, hell yeah, that's our solution, everything. And we got to have that. I was resistant for a long, long time. But I will tell you, in my case, and people I work with, this is a game changer. Having those standards of behavior that we can point to specific words we've said, not like we do a good job and we have a great open door policy and we have a great culture. Like, how does that help in this situation? How does saying we have a great culture help in this situation? We are accountable to each other for everything we do. That's 100% applicable to a situation like this. So, anyhow, those are the things that I would look at is what are the standards we've identified that we're going to hold ourselves to? What do I want this to look like? What is my role? What are my boundaries? And then how do I facilitate that as these things come up? And I hope you got some information here on things that work for me. Again, I can tell you before this stuff, it was not fun. I opened in the beginning talking about that. Some of the worst situations I've ever found myself in as a manager is having these situations, and I got to figure out how to navigate it because I've taken on that responsibility of solving the problem and being the judge. And that is the worst situation I could find myself in. So anyhow, hope this is helpful. As always, if you find this information I share helpful, please share the podcast with a friend or colleague you think could benefit from it. I'm sure you've heard people talk about employee problems. It's a great episode to share with folks. Of course, public sharing is also appreciated. That's it for this week. I'll talk to y'all next week.